Stage 5 is a concept in adult developmental stage theory that is, or used to be, a branch of academic psychological research. I think it may be very important, but stage 5 is somewhat mysterious. It's not clear what it is. Before asking what is stage 5, there's several other questions one ought to ask, starting with, is stage 5? I mean, is this even a thing? Or is it just some kind of psychobabble woo? Why should we believe in this? And then, what sort of thing is stage 5 if it's a thing at all? What is a stage actually? How do we know whether something is a stage or not? How many are there? Which are they? These are skeptical questions that I think if you're interested in adult developmental theory, you ought to be asking these questions, and that's especially true if you're planning to use it or are using it. I'm not going to address those questions at all now, and that's because the answers available in the academic literature where this theory comes from completely suck. They're vague and they're not at all well founded in good empirical data. So I'm going to set those questions aside for now, although I do plan to come back to them. Instead, I'm going to give several answers to what is stage 5 as though that was a clearly meaningful question. I'm going to give several different answers because different theorists in the field describe it in different ways. That's because they came to adult developmental theory with different intellectual frameworks from different disciplines. In the 1970s and 80s, when this was being worked out, there was a really exciting intellectual scene, mostly at Harvard, where people from different departments and fields were bouncing ideas off each other and synthesizing them, and this whole thing emerged out of that. Their different ideas seemed similar in exciting ways, and yet they were different with major disagreements because they were coming in with different lenses. So we ought to ask, were they actually all describing the same thing in quite different terms, like the metaphor of the blind men with the elephant? Or were they actually describing quite different things that they kind of colluded on believing they were talking about the same thing? Unfortunately, academic research in this area pretty much came to a halt around 1990 for, I think, political reasons. And that means that at about the time that they were starting to do really good scientific tests of whose ideas were valid, if anyone's, the whole thing just ended. So we don't know. I'm mostly going to describe my own understanding of stage 5, which is generally consonant with that of most research in the field, but it's also somewhat eccentrically different, and that's because I came to this material from, again, a different set of intellectual disciplines than anyone else working in it. Everyone in the field starts from cognitive developmental psychology, in particular, the theory of Jean Piaget, who had a four-stage theory of children's cognitive development. His fourth final stage was what he called formal operations, which he thought was propositional logic, which is a simple mathematical system. Subsequently, other researchers extended that conception of stage 4 to cover systematic rationality in general. Piaget explicitly denied that there could be any stage 5 because he thought that propositional logic was the ultimately correct form of thought. Subsequently, a number of researchers discovered in the 1970s, or thought they had, that there is some kind of cognition that goes beyond not just propositional logic, but systematic rationality in general. And that's what we call stage 5. So I come to this with a background also in cybernetics, ethnomethodology, existential phenomenology, and Vajrayana Buddhism. And my understanding of stage 5 is shaped by, or maybe distorted or colored by, all of those fields. From cybernetics, I understand developmental stages as patterns of interaction of an organism and its environment. The typical framing of cognitive psychology, by contrast, is in terms of representations within an individual mind, and I'm skeptical of those. From ethnomethodology, I'm skeptical even of the concept of individual minds, or at least of using that as the unit of analysis. We are shaped, our activity is guided by our local social environment and by the culture that we inherit. Our patterns are not primarily personal. From existential phenomenology, I am moved to investigate what being in a stage is like. Being is the existential part, and the like is the phenomenology part. I'm influenced particularly by the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty in that lineage. He emphasized the role of the body in experience and the role of active perception. From Vajrayana Buddhism, I take the habit of seeing all phenomena in terms of the interplay of nebulosity and pattern. Nothing is entirely definite and nothing is entirely arbitrary. We are nebulous and patterned. Everything we interact with is nebulous and patterned, and the interactions themselves are nebulous and patterned. Unfortunately, the insights of each of these 4 disciplines are notoriously difficult to explain in plain language. Cybernetics communicates in mathematics. Ethnomethodology and existential phenomenology use long made-up words and convoluted syntax. And Vajrayana is communicated through ritual and poetry. I'm going to try to describe stage 5 as an experienced interaction, a way of perceiving and acting rather than theorizing about supposed mental structures as cognitive psychologists do. I'm going to do my best to speak plainly, but describing the texture of experience is going to make me come out, I'm afraid, sounding like a stoned hippie. After I babble a bit, I'll summarize briefly some descriptions of stage 5 from academic cognitive scientists. They may be talking nonsense, but at least they sound sober. So what I'm going to talk about is a visual, kinesthetic, embodied experience, and that's especially difficult to talk about. It's easy to talk about thinking because that's already largely in words, and I think a distinctive feature of stage 5 is that it is not so much about thinking in words. What I'm going to describe is not a mystical experience, not hallucinating, not some unusual state of consciousness. It's really difficult to express what sort of thing it is. What I'm hoping is that you will recognize some of the things that I'm talking about, and that you will remember having had these experiences of having been in these ways. I think these are experiences that anyone can have at any stage, if that's even a meaningful thing to say. What may be distinctive about stage 5 is that they become more common and that you gain more skill in being in these ways. So, the first aspect of what I want to talk about is what I call the open field of activity. You can imagine that you're in front of, looking out on a plain, a landscape, and there's all this stuff happening on this landscape. Like things are emerging out of the plain, they're popping out of the ground, and they dance around. They maybe change color, they bump into each other, and then they subside back into the field. And these are the happening things. They're not, in this kind of quasi-metaphorical description I'm giving, these are not generally physical objects. They are matters that call for care, that impinge on your concerns. Sometimes these seem to be coming at you from all directions, like tasks and interruptions and people emoting, and you can feel embattled, and this can be overwhelming. I think this is an experience that everyone has had, this feeling of stuff coming at you metaphorically, and that can give a sense of what sort of description I'm trying to give. In a more characteristically stage 5 experience, you have panoramic vision over the whole field of activity. Your view is outside and from above. At the same time, you can see extremely fine details of these emerging phenomena. It's like you're looking through a fisheye lens and a magnifying glass at the same time. So you see the forest, and you see the trees, and you see the leaves on the trees, and you see the caterpillars walking on the leaves on the trees. So you don't get lost in the details, and you don't get lost in space. Another aspect of this is that you are not detached, you're engaged. The experience of stage 4 can be like looking at the world through a heads-up display. So there's a transparent piece of glass that has projected on it like engineering diagrams or an org chart that is telling you what you are seeing and categorizing it and representing it. This is the experience of stage 4. At stage 5, you can still do that when it's useful, but more typically you're actually looking directly at the world. You're perceiving without an interposed representation. You can still, when it's useful, turn the heads-up display on and use some kind of rational system, some systematic ontology for perceiving, conceptualizing the world. That can often be very useful, and stage 5 can do everything that stage 4 can do. But you also have like a little clicker wheel, so you can choose different heads-up displays, different representations of the world in different conceptual schemas. You can use different frameworks for perception, and you can actually look with multiple ones simultaneously. This is a very characteristic aspect of stage 5. In stage 5, caring about lessens, caring for increases. You're intimately involved with the details of the field of activity because you care for them. It's more like tending a garden than like building and operating a machine, which is the experience of stage 4. It's more nurturing, less controlling. At stage 4, you relate to everything in terms of what does this mean to me? What do you mean to me? What can I do with this thing? Although a garden is still pretty top down, like you decide where to put which rose bush and you put some tulips over here. Maybe a better metaphor would be taking responsibility for a plot of woodland that you nurture. So you make sure that there's adequate water in a drought. You clear out diseased trees. You build brush piles to provide habitat for small mammals. Foresters do this. They pile up dead branches, and rabbits or weasels or I don't know what live in there. This metaphor of nurturing might sound nice, and that's not really the point. Part of caring for a plot of woodland is uprooting invasive plant species. It's setting traps for pest animal species. It's building a fence around the plot to keep out wild dogs. If 30 or 50 feral hogs break through the fence, a semi-automatic rifle might be called for. The next aspect of stage 5 I'd like to talk about is what I call becoming the space. And this is a sense that yourself, your awareness becomes fused with the field of activity, the space within which everything happens. So, in some sense, you feel like you are doing everything that occurs in the field of activity because you are the space. And at the same time, you're not doing anything because you're just the space. You're not any longer an isolated individual in your head who is doing the thing, one thing, and then the next thing. It's a continuous flow of activity that is interaction across all of the participating entities, human and material and information technology or whatever. This sense of extending through space, you also feel decentered in time and like you extend through time. So you become aware of your place in history and that you are in the middle of a lineage of people doing things, thinking and feeling and being in ways that are shaping you now. This can extend centuries into the past, centuries into the future, but also just years or any period of time. And just as with the spatial metaphor, where you're seeing all the details, you're getting this really close in look, and you're seeing the whole picture. With time, you're much more present in the now. In stage 4, your time is structured. It is scheduled, you have deadlines, you're doing this, and then you're doing this, and you know what's going to happen next. The stage 5 experience of time is of being here now without the structure. It's also the experience of being across centuries because you're not separate from those who have gone before. They are being you, and you are being the future. All of the people who come after you. There's a quote from Abraham Maslow that I find really moving. He wrote, "I had a vision once at Brandeis University. It was at commencement. I had ducked commencement for years, but this one I couldn't duck. I was corralled. And I felt there was something kind of stupid about these processions and idiotic medieval caps and gowns. This time, as the faculty stood waiting for the procession to begin, for some reason there was suddenly this vision. It wasn't a hallucination. It was as if I could imagine very vividly a long academic procession. This makes me cry, actually. It went way the hell into the future, into some kind of misty, cloudy thing. The procession contained all my past colleagues, all the people I like, Erasmus, Socrates. And then the procession extended into a dim cloud in which were all sorts of people not yet born. And these were also my colleagues. I felt very brotherly toward them, these future ones. It's the transcending of time and space which becomes quite normal. Robert Keegan, who's one of the foremost theorists in this area, says that in his data set, he finds that nobody really gets to stage 5 until age 40. You have to have had decades of experience in order to begin to get this sense of one's extension in time, of being the past and being the future at the same time. And maybe it's not until you get to 40 that that really sinks in and shapes you. This sense of the diffusion of oneself, of being extended, being the space, leads you to experience me as being one of the things that happens within the space of activity. So me is just one object among all these other happening things. It's not that you stop having a self. It's that the selfing is an activity that happens within the space that you are. And lots of different kinds of selfing activity may arise from the field and dance around and then submerge again. And this is very funny. It leads to a sense of humor about oneself. You can't take yourself seriously if you're just this little dancing puppet. So you're much less bothered by people's negative opinions about you because the me is not an especially significant thing in there. So you're freed up to play. It's serious play because you do care for the whole field, but you're not identified with outcomes. You're aware of risks, you take sensible actions, you may be unhappy when things go badly, but it's not saying something about you so much anymore. Within the field of activity, because you are seeing through multiple lenses, there's a lot of scope for paradox, for contradiction, that you're seeing in different ways simultaneously. And this is really funny and enjoyable because contradiction is no longer a problem. You can integrate both sides of a contradiction without needing to resolve it in favor of one side or the other, because these are both valid ways of looking at things. So that was me sounding like I'm on drugs. I'm going to now briefly talk about a series of academic characterizations of stage 5. It may actually be helpful to see how each of these descriptions is incomplete or inaccurate, so one can understand what stage 5 is in terms of what it isn't quite. Similarly, a lot of the standard explanations of stage 5 are in terms of what it isn't, namely stage 4. As you've heard, it's really difficult to describe stage 5 in its own terms, and as you move toward a new stage or are not yet firmly embedded in it, it's actually a lot easier to look back at the previous stage and say, not that, than to look forward or down or around and say, okay, this is where I am now and this is how it is. This is on top of the problem that stage 5, unlike stage 4, is mostly not about explicit representations, which are easy to verbalize. The term stage 5 itself is really a what it isn't description, namely, it isn't stage 4, it's something else. It's good as a term, and I use it a lot because it's basically meaningless. It doesn't try to tell you what stage 5 is, and so that leaves it as an open space of possibility where a bunch of these other academic terms are trying to nail it down in a way that doesn't seem to be all that helpful. Calling it stage 5 does drag in Piaget's stage theory, which is definitely questionable. Is there actually such a thing as a stage? This is a question, and using the term stage 5 prejudges that. So I actually also like to use other terms which don't prejudge that. I use the term fluid. This is good primarily by contrast with stage 4, which is really marked by its rigidity, its dualism. Stage 4 is about this, not that. Sharp distinctions, logic. There's a couple of problems with the term fluid. One is that it could describe stage 3, which is also non-rigid. Another is that a fluid is homogeneous and undifferentiated, and stage 5 isn't that. So the term fluid might point toward what I call monism, the all is one idea that is definitely not what stage 5 is about. Stage 5, we saw, is intensely attuned to details and differences as well as the big picture. The first term for stage 5 was post-formal. That is defining it in terms of what Piaget had said stage 4 was, namely formal. There's a quote here from a review article. Various theories arose which were based on the assumption that the distinctive characteristic was the acceptance and integration of various, at times incompatible truths, which were highly dependent upon context and upon the way in which the subject perceives them, without the subject needing, as in stage 4, to look for and find a single truth. Such theories provoked great enthusiasm in the scientific community. I think that is a relatively accurate description of an important aspect of stage 5. Post-formal points to a rejection of propositional logic, which goes all the way back to Aristotle. It's the logic of the law of the excluded middle, that every statement is either absolutely true or absolutely false. And that's something that stage 5 critically rejects. This is not a new idea. So one of the first terms applied to stage 5 in the 1970s was dialectical. And this is going back to Hegel, who is not my favorite person. But we do have to admit that Hegel had a bunch of ideas that were wrong in detail, but in general trend turned out to be really important and correct in some ways. And one was his rejection of Aristotelian true-false logic, and that's what dialectic is supposed to be about. It's taking multiple frameworks and aiming for a synthesis, or at least working with the contradiction without trying to resolve it. Another early term besides dialectical that was applied to stage 5 was reflective. This is good because it describes the way that stage 5 stands apart from systems and can take this view from above and around, not being locked into a system, but looking outside on top of it and being able to intervene in systems from outside. This isn't, however, really unique to stage 5. Keegan says that each stage is in some sense a theory of the previous stage. So stage 4 is a theory of stage 3. Relationships are the substance or a critical part of the substance of stage 3, and they're not thematized. You are in relationships. Stage 4 is a theory of relationships. It structures relationships, and you have to reflect on relationships. So reflectiveness is not actually a distinctive feature of stage 5. When it develops into stage 4 by conceptualizing the limitations and failure modes of stage 3, there's another problem with the term reflection, which is it is typically taken to be a cognitive operation. It's thinking about. And this is actually de-emphasized in stage 5. I mean, certainly in stage 5 you do all kinds of difficult thinking, but that's not the distinctive substance of it. Other terms that are applied to stage 5 in literature are relativistic and contextual. This could also describe stage 3, which is similar to stage 5 in some ways. There's a stage 3 attitude of everybody's opinion is equally valid because everybody has their own experience, and that could be understood as relative and contextual. Stage 5 is relativistic and contextual, again, relative to stage 4. Metasystematic is a term that I use and that other theorists in the field use. It is, again, a way of talking about this ability to see things in multiple ways simultaneously. But as a term, it's problematic because it suggests that's all you're doing, and it centers systems. Stage 5 is not primarily about systems in the way that stage 4 is. Stage 5 uses systems sometimes when they're useful, but that's not, again, its substance. There's another problem here, which is that metasystematic suggests a system of systems. This is a very common misunderstanding. Stage 5 is not itself a system. It's not a system of systems. Understanding how a superordinate system can subsume and incorporate another system within itself, that just gives you another system. This is a stage 4 recursive operation. It's not stage 5. What one subsumes systems within at stage 5 is the space, the field of activity. Systems appear as entities that pop out of the ground, they spin around, and they go flump back into the ground. The term interindividual is used in Keegan's book, The Evolving Self, as the term for stage 5. It points towards this decentering of oneself, but it, again, leaves intact the idea that there are distinct selves, that stage 5 is again about how selves relate to each other, and in stage 5 they interpenetrate in a way that they don't at stage 4, and they are structured in a way that they aren't at stage 3. But at stage 5, selves are not the thing, and this is, I think, a limitation in Keegan's understanding. In his later book, In Over Our Heads, he used the term self-transforming. Again, this centers self as the key thing. It also has the problem that each stage represents a fundamental transformation of selfing, a very different mode of self occurring than the previous one. So transformation is an aspect of every stage, or every transition at least. I think he's pointing to the fact that at stage 5, a transformation continues and it's a deliberate act. And that is actually true and important. But again, the self is not the key thing, I think. At stage 5, because the self is no longer an entity, there isn't a coherent thing that could act to transform itself. Rather, the delocalized patterns of activity, which we think of as selfing, continue to transform not through the action of the self on itself, but through interaction with everything in the context, the situation, the field, the space of activity. That's what accomplishes the transformation. I'm sounding like a stoned hippie again.